Hello, good morning, good afternoon. I hope no one is having a good night yet. Welcome everybody to our webinar. Thank you for making this time to be with us with all that is happening. This is a webinar by the African Feminist Collective on Feminist Informed Policies. And in this webinar, we hope to really look at defining and reclaiming feminist informed foreign policies in Africa, and hope to shed light on what really this is, because oftentimes when we've written or said something online in various spaces, a lot of feminists say, what is this feminist foreign policy space? What does it look like? What does it hold for us? So we hope to continue having engagements like this to really bring up the work we're already doing, but to really bring our voices and shaping the frameworks that are happening, the practice, the discourse, to bring African feminist experiences, voices, and shape the direction we want to go in. And that's really our intention here. We have had a lot of debate and discourse about feminist foreign policy, but a lot of times it's been out of the continent and it's been very dominated. So I hope as a collective and as we bring in more and more voices is to see that we shape what we see as foreign policies that are informed by feminist practice, African feminist practice, past and present. So we hope to use this kind of discourse to, challenge existing structures, language, histories, and the current direction through which states and non-state actors are moving as we go along. So we have seen in the recent past, we've seen the African Union joining the G20. We are at the intersection of so many struggles right now: economical, political, macroeconomic, environmental. We know the climate change talks are happening soon, because we also know that we are in the middle of very many disturbing wars and such human loss and such tragedies that we are experiencing as a continent, from Sudan to Burkina Faso to Mozambique to Somalia, to all these countries, and it's very, very important to reflect on the ties that run through each conflict that you might see on the continent, whether active war or a rush for minerals, DRC, for example, where we have 7 million people displaced within their own countries, and many other conflicts that we are seeing, and today's challenges, climate change. We see movements on challenging colonial legacies, speaking of reparations and bringing back all the African cultural artifacts that still held in colonizers' museums and other storage places they thought were best place to store these important art crafts. So it's very, very important that we see foreign policies as encompassing so many different aspects of our lives. So it's very important that then African feminist thought is brought into this discourse. So to go with me today in today's webinar, our proposed speakers, we have Memory Kachambwa and Reem Abbas, and last but not least, we have Toni Haastrup. I will go quickly through their bios so that we are able to know who they are. Memory is an intersection of feminists, a women's rights activists with over 18 years of experience working on issues of gender and development and human rights at national, regional, and international levels. She holds a master's in philosophy, in management, integrated water resources, with a focus on women in leadership. She's currently pursuing a second master's degree in peace, human rights, gender, and development. So welcome, Memory, and we are glad that you could join us. And Memory is also part of the collective from the very start. Our second speaker, Reem Abbas. Reem is a writer, researcher, and political commentator with expertise in women's rights in civic space. She is a feminist activist and a former member on the coordination committee of the Sudanese Women in Civil and Political Groups, known as MANSAM, the largest women's coalition in Sudan. She's the 2013-2014 non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Reem, very welcome. It's been quite a year, but we are glad for the work you're doing and for showing up despite what is going on in Sudan and outside, that you're showing up in these spaces. We stand with you in solidarity, as always. You're welcome to this space. Last but not least, we have Toni. Toni is the chair in global politics at the University of Manchester. She's passionate about research that connects academia and policy. She has more than 15 years working in academia in the non-for-profit environments. She has contributed to various efforts on women, peace and security, agenda, and foreign feminist policies. Toni is an occasional commentator who works with media outlets, such as different media outlets, to really give different perspectives on global politics and policies, African regional integration, and many other things. Toni holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, as well as degrees from the University of Cape Town and the University of California, Davis. Toni, you are welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Toni is the member of the collective. I would like to also recognize Helen Kezie-Noha and Pauline Kagumire, who are two of them behind the scenes and making sure this webinar runs on time and giving us all the support we need with the logistics, and they're key members of the collective. So everybody, you're welcome to this webinar. And I hope that we do justice to really bring to you what feminist foreign policies look like and what our contributions would then look like as African feminists. To announce that there's a recording for this webinar, so it will be available after, and we'll be able to share it with you. Welcome participants to this webinar. Would like to hear from you, your name, share your name, your organization, your country, how you like to be known, and you know, throughout the next hour and a half, you can let us know your feedback about the various issues that we are going to be taking us through. To kick us off into this webinar will be Toni. Toni will present the statement of intent on feminist informed policies abroad and at home, which we crafted as a collective, having been in various different spaces that were discussing feminist foreign policies. And we just felt like not enough was being representative of the diverse and really deep African feminist organizing, academia, and you know, it wasn't matching what we see at home. So we thought we needed to have a space to be able to articulate what these aspirations are and what we need to change, both in Africa and outside, and how other countries and other organizations relate to the continent and what can be called feminist on the continent. So Toni will take us through, and Toni being the teacher, she will really go through like feminist foreign policies, the genesis, and how do we find ourselves at this point, and then into the statement. Toni, you're welcome, and take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosebell. I hope I can live up to the promise of what you've stated there. And welcome to everyone. It's afternoon here. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening for some of you. So some of you might have joined us earlier in the year where we had a similar convening to sort of try to make sense of a feminist foreign policy in an African context. And I think following our first gathering, we were motivated to think about how precisely we engage with the feminist foreign policy agenda, and particularly given our general skepticism of the idea of a feminist foreign policy. But let me take a step back to really think through, what exactly is feminist foreign policy? In 2014, then Minister for Foreign Affairs in Sweden declared that Sweden was going to have a feminist foreign policy. Now, this was interesting, I think, for a lot of feminists globally, and exciting, because it was the first time that it was at a time when there'd been I would say, a rising angst against those who promote gender equality, which is one of the key principles, a key principle of feminists agitating. Feminist foreign policy, however, is defined by each government that enacts it. So since Sweden, we've had Canada declare a feminist international assistance policy. More recently, and perhaps much more prominently, we've had Germany with its feminist development policy and guidelines on feminist foreign policy. In the interim, you had France declare feminist diplomacy. Luxembourg, Spain has a feminist foreign policy. Libya in Africa has a feminist foreign policy. Of course, Mexico was the first country in the global south to declare feminist foreign policy. And more recently, Chile has also signaled that. As we speak, it is the case, or at least as of last week, it was the case that the Netherlands is trying to really underscore its own feminist foreign policy. However, I think it would be remiss of me not to highlight the fact that as of today, in all likelihood, the Netherlands is going to have a right-wing government, and a right-wing government that is considered far right by some, and will be supported very much by even the far right and the center right, which I think is worth thinking about how this puts in jeopardy the opportunities for a feminist foreign policy. But I think it's also important to understand that feminist foreign policy does not exist in isolation from the histories and identities of the incumbent state. And I think this is useful to know, but can also be quite challenging, because it allows states to define the boundaries of what counts and what doesn't count, which I think can be quite harmful to feminist aspirations. Yet, I think feminist foreign policy, or the choice to define feminist foreign policy, suggests that there is a scope for change around what foreign policy is. In the end, a lot of the conversation, of course, is around gender equality and often around women's rights. However, I think one of the questions that we've raised is, if this is the case, what is new? After all, a lot of the states are already engaged in gender programming, for example. I think feminist foreign policy, nevertheless, whatever it is we accept it to be, which includes issues around gender equality, can be understood as a shift in the foreign policy discourse. But the question is, to what end? And I think that if you ask the state, they might again focus very much on gender equality and gender programming. If you ask civil society, they have very different aspirations. It doesn't mean that those aspirations don't come together. So if you think, for example, centers like the Feminist Foreign Policy Collective and the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, they have clear ideas about what feminism should be doing in the foreign policy context. In a sense, then, in our statement is how we're trying to locate the global south, and in particular Africa, within a bunch of these debates, both in the context of states, who are the primary arbiters of what foreign policy is, but also civil society. And this is important because often the global south, including Africa, is usually the target for feminist foreign policy. And yet, often the dynamics of this particular geographic, cultural, and imagined space is not understood by those people who are writing so-called feminist foreign policy or trying to enact it. But we also notice that we find a similar challenge when it comes to knowledge making around feminist foreign policy, which is co-constituted but often ignores African feminist concerns. So if the world is moving towards more feminism in policy, where are African feminists located? Moreover, what does it mean for Africans when the world is moving towards more feminism? In a sense, this is a basis for why we're here, and it's a basis for why we've written what we wrote. So taking together that fundamental discomfort with the idea of a foreign policy that can be feminist, given that foreign policy itself is hierarchical and antithetical to the sort of feminist world that we imagine. Yet, at the same time, wanting to account and engage with this thing that states are calling feminist foreign policy, we came together through what I would call a sort of process of decolonial feminist praxis, and we have collectively authored that statement, which hopefully some of you have access to. We've structured the statement around a range of themes. It starts first with this idea that actually, because we are hardly ever present, or when we are present, we are given very, very specific functions, we are asking that space be actually made for both African feminist bodies, but also, and subsequently, African feminist knowledges to also underpin the ways in which we interpret what sort of feminist futures we want across a range of policy areas. We also argued that where we've seen in actual practice is feminist research tends not to be funded a lot. And even much more so when it comes to feminist research that centers Africa. So this was one of our demands, that this research has to be funded because you can only know by researching, by engaging. Another dimension of the statement is that we ask that global militarization be challenged. And this is very significant for us. As most of you would know, where all of us are situated, we have either experienced or know of colleagues and family that are experiencing conflict. These conflicts cannot be separated from increasing global militarization. The investments in weapons transfer is out of control. This year saw the largest investments in military spending globally. And yet, social services are in crisis, more conflicts prevail. So what exactly are these weapons doing? To our mind, this militarization, which is often also embodied of a certain hierarchization and certain masculinities, undermines any sort of feminist potential, including that of gender equality or recognized women's rights. We believe that feminist aspirations of the world around us cannot really proceed or cannot really be understood without taking climate policies and the climate crisis seriously. And so far, including a lot of the states that have declared feminist foreign policy, although they account for the climate crisis as being one of the most profound challenges of our time, often they do not engage with indigenous knowledges about how to mitigate the climate crisis. They do not engage with indigenous folks about how to think about climate action in general. And certainly, they don't engage in the African context on ecofeminist perspectives, which we think is rather odd, particularly when the implementation of climate action is targeted towards Africa. We know of increasingly that, the Mediterranean is essentially now a graveyard of African brothers and sisters, precisely because of the migration regimes of including global North countries that have declared feminist foreign policy. We see migration justice crisis as a feminist issue, not just because it affects women, but because, again, in the migration regimes, we really see the ways in which states' ideas of manliness comes into play in a way that negatively affects Africans consistently. We ask that rather than introducing new ideas about, how the global North can do feminism better in the global South, that they actually give attention to looking at existing mechanisms and existing frameworks like the Maputo Protocol, which is considered objectively as one of the most progressive frameworks, even when it's not being implemented properly by African states. We also argue, finally, that reparations and reparative justice has to be at the heart of development. Whereas right now, a lot of development cooperation again reinforces that hierarchical relationship between the global north and the global south. It's not the global north that is developing us. It's not the global south that is, just underdeveloped, but rather that the global south has been underdeveloped at the expense of the global north through different processes of extraction and exploitation. So to sort of conclude, thinking through next steps, we focused in this statement very much on the global north countries that have declared feminist foreign policies, taking it together, thinking through what their ideas are, and trying to challenge them to think through the African perspective more thoroughly. But of course, our overall intent is not just about foreign policy, because that's the easy one, but really thinking about how do we make policies in general more feminist? And of course, to think through that effectively, we have to turn the gaze inwards as well. So to conclude in the statement, we say that we think that both our states, our African states, our leadership, regional organizations should pay more attention to our feminist reimagining of what our continent could look like, but not just the African continent, but Africans and African feminists in the diaspora. And to do this, we believe that we can only do this by engaging and working with other African feminists in the usual tradition of collaborative working that African feminism suggests is the only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toni, for that deep dive into how we arrive at this moment. Yeah, I have reminded myself that I didn't introduce myself. I'm sorry for main character syndrome. My name is Rosebell Kagumire. I am a writer, an editor, and activist. I curate AfricanFeminist.com platform where I work with different writers to document various struggles both on the continent and diaspora. And I'm happy to be your moderator today. And I see a couple of people that we've really worked with on this area, Nancy Kachambwa, Lebohang. We're really grateful for all the work you're doing in terms of decolonizing various areas, decolonial approaches, and advancing South-South collaborations, because this is very important again when we are looking at decolonizing and what kind of existing relationships sometimes that are difficult have not been maintained because of the structural challenges within international systems, yet these are very historical connections and relationships that we need to continue learning from and continue enriching and building together. So thank you for that work on South-South collaborations that you're doing for now. I will move to second speaker, Reem. Reem is going to tell us about the extent to which feminist foreign policies use decolonized approaches in supporting the implementation of the women, peace, and security agenda in Africa, such a difficult moment to even reflect. So Reem, please show us the way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rosebell, and thank you, colleagues. I'm very happy to be here. I think definitely feminist foreign policy is a new area for me, and it's something that I am thinking about more and more right now. I'm here to really raise questions, and I'm here to share some thoughts with you, and I'm also here to listen and learn, as I work to develop also how I feel about this. So I'm coming here really with an open heart to learn more from you than to share with you. So I'm going to just go ahead and present, and I'm also going to try my best to mention some examples from the Sudanese context where I'm from. I mean, because at the end of the day, I'm trying to understand things, as a, woman from Africa, as a woman from Sudan specifically. I think, first of all, I want to say that decolonization and feminist foreign policy are also becoming buzzwords, and this is not in a bad way or a good way, but every few years, unfortunately, we see a focus on not on approaches or like organic change, but on theories and concepts that are very loaded, and then a lot of resources and attention is invested, but then it seems that people move on to other areas, not considering that a lot of effort has been invested in developing the concept, through and production of literature, and that a lot of groundwork has been done. So a lot of the times I feel that we work on things, such as, for example, gender mainstreaming, different buzzwords that happen every few years, and then all this groundwork kind of is not taken into consideration, and then you have other concepts that come along and people start forgetting what we're working on. So it's very important to always think that everything we're doing right now, we're building on concepts, we're building on literature, we're building on the work of many people, especially when we're talking about decolonization. We're building on the work of Gayatri, we're building on the writings of Frantz Fanon. So a lot of the things that we're talking about today, people have spent considerable time to develop them as theories and as concepts, for decades. So we are kind of still on a journey. We did not start this journey right now. This journey has been started by people before us. So I want to first try to define what we mean by decolonization, and also by feminist foreign policy, and try to conceptualize the terms, and also bring in some thoughts from Sylvia Tamali, who wrote an amazing book, Decolonization and Afrofeminism. And later on, I will discuss why she put a huge responsibility on our shoulders as African feminists. So decolonization is a process by which we understand our role. When it comes to research, decolonizing research means ensuring that the local voice is there, it's at the center, and that the local voice, indigenous people, are at the center of the research process. So in general, it is a process of our ongoing anti-colonial struggles against systems that continues to subordinate us and our ideas, our culture, our writings, and our ability to contribute to conversations, and our ability to be at the center of our own stories and histories. By decolonizing cultural and political spaces, we are asserting our presence. We are asserting our contributions. We are not just communities that lived under colonial rule, but we are people with a long history. In this sense, by recognizing our history and our knowledge and our ability to build on our oral history, which is always undermined, we're not rejecting, Western methodologies of, research and thinking and so on, but we're bringing ours to the forefront. And we're making them central to the conversations we're having. And Tamali makes us feel responsible as African feminists, because she makes an argument that we have the responsibility to lead in this decolonization work when it comes to African societies. And by doing so, we would be able to, in a way, holistically challenge, the patriarchal systems that are very much holding us back in our communities. And through her writings, she has almost given us a roadmap that we can build on, because we can't tackle the women, peace, and security agenda as part of our governance structures without challenging the patriarchy. The WPS agenda is critical for all African countries and for all countries really in the world, whether they are in conflict or post-conflict. But they're not standalone. They don't operate on their own. They don't work when this process is just led by donor money and government institutions are just after this money, just like in the case of Sudan, where it became a situation of just ticking the box, saying that we have a national action plan and saying that we are adopting this women, peace, and security agenda. No, it's not about just, seeking donor money to draft something. But we can, because the WPS agenda needs to be part of our policies, and it needs to be part of the way we even think about governance. We have to take a deeper look at the political marketplaces of countries where you have governance structures that are based on loyalties and people buying or intimidating their way into government. Alex Duell defines the political marketplace as a contemporary system of governance characterized by pervasive monetized patronage in the form of exchange of political loyalty or cooperation for payment. So in the case of like Sudan, for example, the political marketplace is largely controlled by men with guns, armed forces and militias, as well as traditional leadership, and of course, flawed and patriarchal political parties. The political parties and traditional leadership, of course, they enter and exit this marketplace based on the allegiances they can offer to this very dynamic political marketplace. Political marketplaces thrive on patriarchal norms because conflict, insecurity, corruption, and extractive economies are some of its characteristics. Right now in the war that is being, fought in Sudan, the leader of the militia that is fighting, against the national army, a few years ago, he said something that's very striking. He said that if you don't fight, you don't have an opinion. And I think this really represents the heart of the political marketplace, that if you don't fight, you don't have an opinion. And if you don't have an opinion, how can you contribute to policies? And if you can't contribute to policies, how can you make sure that, you have things like the women, peace, and agenda in place and active? So we have to challenge this marketplace, because women cannot be in power if civil nonviolent politics are not the norm. And as long as the military is at the center of the political process, women will be underrepresented. And if women are underrepresented, then the WPS agenda does not make sense. And here I want to reflect on what Cynthia Enlow wrote. She said that women's political participation cannot be effective if they don't have gender consciousness and some feminist understanding, and not be so constrained that, they cannot act on this consciousness. So in this sense, it is important to reiterate that we cannot expect for civil non-politics alone to advance women's participation. But we also have to reflect on the women's movements in Africa. What are we doing to ensure that our women's movements are not, just like Sondra Hill calls them, the wings of the patriarchy? In most post-colonial countries, the women's movement has been hijacked, by the ruling political parties. The political parties have initiated women's wings to secure the women's voice and secure the women's votes, and to monopolize spaces on women's rights in the national and international arena, and also to support the patriarchal system. And this is the case of in Sudan, where in post-colonial Sudan, you always had the main ruling political party, and then they would have a women's wing, and this women's wings would completely monopolize all the spaces, weakening and leading to the constant, in a way, subordination of the women's movement, and creating a situation where an organic women's movement is really just unable to rise. So moving on, after commenting on decolonization and the women, peace, and security agenda, let us position this within the feminist foreign policy, framework. For the feminist foreign policy to genuinely advance the WPS agenda, it needs to be demilitarized. And here you might be confused, like, how is it a feminist foreign policy and it's, it needs to be demilitarized? Yes, and I say that because if we cannot disconnect national and international security from military spending on arms, then we cannot be secure and we cannot have peace. And if we can't have peace, then women and peace and security cannot be there. And we cannot continue to reproduce insecurity for women and then expect the women, peace, and security agenda to work. So in this sense, a country cannot have a feminist foreign policy and then still continue to expand its military expenditure, and continue to export, weapons, and continue to be part of different proxy wars, and then claim that it has a feminist foreign policy, because you cannot have a feminist foreign policy if your policies and your economy and the way you structure your trade impacts the security of women in your country and in other countries. So here, for example, if we look at the example of Sweden, which in, of course, 2014 became the first country to adopt feminist foreign policy, and then they revoked this policy in 2022, amid efforts, of course, of the right wing to cut spending on foreign aid, but also to increase their security, expenditure in response to the war on Ukraine. Again, countries have to marry their foreign policy with their internal policies. And if a feminist foreign policy approach to policymaking is taken, then we have to really reconsider what does this mean. Like I said, you cannot continue to spend on arms and encourage, trade around arms, and then expect the women peace and security agenda to work. Finally, I want to reflect on the feminist statement against war in Sudan that was published on the 30th of August, 2023, because I believe that it really fits in into our understanding, during this webinar. The statement conceptualizes women, peace, and security within our understanding of social norms and how they play into militarization. Again, this is a way to decolonize how we understand women, peace, and security, because we cannot understand WPS without looking at our cultural and social norms and understanding how our own social norms play into militarization. So this statement, it was written by a number of feminists from Sudan, and they do not claim that they represent all women, of course, but they invite people to discuss the war and establish a stance that is deeply rooted in the age-old feminist struggle for peace and freedom in Sudan. This statement effectively established that a war never just starts when the first bullet is struck, but it has foundations and structures that create a social, economic, and political base that instigates violence. You cannot understand the conflict without looking at military expenditure, the militarization of the state, or the international capitalist systems with its institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, that wants governments to implement programs to subjugate populations and turn civilians into sources of customs and taxes in a dehumanizing way. And it also highlighted that rape as a weapon of war cannot be untied from social norms that turn women's bodies into commodities for exploitation. And the statement reads, their bodies have always been considered the property of the strongest, used once as a weapon for victory over opponents and another time as a backdrop for the political truces of their victory for masculinity. And I just wanted to mention the statement because the way it approached, understanding and conceptualizing the war, it did so by decolonizing the way we understand women, peace, and security in our local context, and what it means for Sudanese women. And it also gave a framework for how a WPS agenda should look like in Sudan. Lastly, I just want to say that just when I said the quote earlier by the leader of the militia, Hemeti, who said that if you don't have arms, then you don't have a voice, or if you don't fight, then you don't have a voice. We have to continue pushing for peace that includes women. We have to continue pushing for peace where women have basically the ultimate, like the ultimate participation rate when it comes to sharing their ideas and thoughts and coming up with an organic peace, that fits their communities and their needs and their lived experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reem, for that excellent run through in terms of women, peace, and security, and weaving international, concerns at the international and foreign spaces. Coming back home, this struggle between male-led, systems from imperialist, capitalist arms industry, and then other grassroots also being held back with the patriarchal norms, which is enabled and extended by the same capitalist systems that gives a warlord arms and at the same time gives you as Sudanese women some money to appear on a peace talk where you're the same people arming the person responsible for us to where the country is. So these are the kind of contradictions that, you know, that are very important for African feminists to highlight, that there's nothing feminist about your policy if your policies making us end up where we are right now. So these are very, very legitimate, important concerns and questions that we have to continue pushing back on for any country that also tries to say they have a feminist foreign policy. But also highlighting the fragility, I think also Toni had alluded to that, talked about this, the fragility of when countries say we have a feminist foreign policy, but the same country's politics is shifting towards the right that is deeply you know, not overtly and consistently racist and imperialist and not very narrow-minded in terms of who belongs and who doesn't belong in those confines of the state. So that is also a very big topic in terms of what we are dealing with when countries pronounce a feminist foreign policy, but then your population is now voting into right-wing politicians who are anti-Black, who are anti-Arab, who are colonized people. Basically, they don't wish to see any progress of our lives, and yet you will be appearing somewhere and say we have a feminist foreign policy. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't match. So these are the conversations that are very, very important for us to continue picking up on. And I think we are having good questions coming through. Please send the questions. We will get to them. Anything, clarifications, any point that you think stands out and you would want to hear more about that, please use the chat to send those questions. And we have shared in the chat the statement that Toni read through, the statement of intent on about the collective and really painting imaginations of the future, how we can engage with this framework of feminist policies. Our last speaker, Memory is going to take us through the African feminist alternatives to climate action. And this is really also very timely because we are at the time where whether you look at conflict and any other crisis, climate change is at the heart of it. You know, a few months ago, we saw what happened in Libya, over 10,000 people dead in just a few days of rain. We have seen consistently cyclones from Mozambique to the drought in Somalia and different parts of Eastern and Horn of Africa and the Sahel. So all these things pushing many populations to the margins and exacerbating already existing tensions and between communities, but also states. So it's a very important topic that we are able to look at it. What would be a feminist foreign policy, not only for countries towards Africa, but also as African countries? What would that look like? What are alternatives, especially as we are the least polluters and we are most affected on the forefront of this climate crisis? What does the feminist alternatives look like for us? Welcome, Memory.
Thank you so much, Rosebell, and it's great to be here again. And I just want to make a disclaimer that I'm not a climate expert, but I think it's also to also dismantle this issue around expertise, because I think this is what the Feminist Foreign Policy Collective is trying to bring and say we have been missing. I think in the statement of intent, it's very clear that African voices has been missing, contribution has been missing, where we are defining from our own perspective, from our lived realities. So I think I would just speak to not so much alternatives, because I feel we need to come up, the people who have to come up, we need to create the space for us to be able to come up with our own solutions, but also space for us to also challenge what needs to shift, what systemic changes need to happen if we are to have the alternatives that we always assume for. And I also want to really start with Toni when she, in the statement of intent, that we should really be taking climate crisis seriously and as a feminist issue, and that we have seen within the feminist foreign policies that there seems to be a bit of shying in terms of the critical issues around the climate crisis. So I just wanted to also maybe just talk about how and why it is important for us, because we've seen that as African feminists, most of our work has really been around the intersection of multiple inequalities. And I think for us, this is how we bring it, the nexus between the climate crisis, the nexus between the economic system and the geopolitical system. So in really looking and situating and saying, if we talk about the climate crisis, it should be a priority, and we should have feminist foreign policies. So the feminist foreign policies that you do see, they don't really deep dive in addressing, in particularly the colonial legacies that we find ourselves, the triple crises on the debt issues, the trade inequalities that we see we are always facing. So the first point I really wanted to put is that if we look at the multiple conflicts on the continent, we see that when issues around climate, just climate justice, they seem not to take priority and are not, so climate crisis is not considered a crisis as much as conflict is considered as a crisis. Yet we find, I think, Rosebell, you mentioned different examples of where we've seen how devastating and how fragile the continent is in terms of adapting and as well as mitigating the climate crisis. Whenever we have a crisis, we are the most hard hit, and we find that the communities are usually ignored and there isn't any safety net. The response is it's not coordinated, and there are not enough funding, especially within the fiscal space, to support the crisis. So I think it's important to note that when we talk of climate crisis, it should be a crisis. It should be, there must be resources. Most resources will be diverted to militarization. I think, Reem, you really mentioned and you really gave us examples around that, militarization around that, and how that also then has a huge impact and a huge effect in terms of responding to the crisis. I think the second point is really around issues around migration, which is induced by climate. And we've seen how within the global space, there hasn't been that acknowledgement that, addressing the climate crisis. And I say this because we find that it's mostly the communities, the women, the girls who are really much affected with the migration. And it is also saying, how do we bring this within the feminist foreign policy discourse as a priority and making the linkages around that. And I think the last thing I also wanted to really emphasize on was the issue related mostly to what we keep hearing around the just transition and how that is playing out within the global climate discourse, and how it's mostly being pitched as a transition, more like a technological change without addressing some of the underlying gender structural issues that we are always looking at. So I think it's important to also say that when we talk of the transition to a just transition, it should also be a gender just transition, and also look beyond just the technological, but issues around renewable energy, but issues around access, reducing also the burden of care that we know is also caused when we don't have when we don't have renewable energy. We know that it's the women who carry the highest burden when it also comes to issues that that have to do with energy. And then I think I was also going to say that I think when we talk of what alternatives that we need to look at, I think we need to look at how do we start coming up with funding, challenging, for example, the financing models. So there's so many financing models within the climate space that are being proposed, and rightfully so. We are just at the verge of going into COP28, where they'll be discussing adaptation fund, loss and damage fund. And I think it's important when we're not seeing this within the feminist foreign policy. And I think this is why, as a collective, but also coming from the continent, we must be also putting this agenda on the table. There's no talk of reparations. And even when reparations becomes almost like, even when they talk about them, some of our African leaders, it's not even going to make that systemic change that is going to address some of the gender inequalities and oppressive systems that we experience. So I think it's very important to be, when you talk of how global financing mechanisms to address the climate crisis, it's a foreign policy issue. So within that, there must be voice from the continent. And I think we've seen a lot of work on the continent where feminist frontline activists have really been coming up and saying we need to have mechanisms that are grant-based, that are not managed by Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, but also mechanisms that are also going to address the structural inequalities beyond them just coming in to say for infrastructure, etc. Yeah, so I think from my end, maybe those are some of the key issues that I really think are important to also consider, and how that also looks at redistributing the wealth, the resources that come to address issues around the climate crisis. I also wanted to mention that we also see a lot around like currently most of there's a lot of extraction going on, which is linked to building a green economy. And we see that intersection coming in DRC, in Eastern DRC. We're seeing how there's also the intersection between conflict, extractivism, and that also being used as a means and a way to address the climate crisis. The issues around how indigenous communities are being displaced in Tanzania, just close by, where they're being displaced as being sinks for carbon markets. And these are some of the key issues that I think we must be challenging. We must also be bringing forth to say, within the whole feminist foreign policy discourse, these are some of the critical issues that we must be. And if some of the governments that we see with feminist foreign policy, they sort of like play a lot of they have feminist foreign policies, but we see when we are at the global scale doing the negotiations, they are still bringing in their very colonial extractive agenda, which is neo-colonial. And I think we need to always consistently challenge them based on that as well. So I will stop for now, Rosebell, but I'm happy to come back again and maybe bring in more examples and maybe bring in more, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Memory, for that quick rundown through climate change, the situation where we find ourselves, and reminding us of like, it's very important, like, to move back into how do we read the mechanisms that are being presented to us, what the kind of alternatives are being presented as progressive, but really still steeped in the colonial agenda. Which reminded me, it's only a few years ago, if not 3 or 4 years ago, like that for the first time, the panel on climate change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 30 plus years existence, was the first time they accepted that colonization, that climate change has largely been pushed by colonization, that colonization is one of the greatest contributors to the climate crisis that we are in here. And with colonization, of course, we're talking about capitalist extraction of indigenous lands, and that is still happening. And how do we go into these talks or any rooms, or even as our governments are having bilateral conversations and agreements, that we really infuse these conversations with historic knowledge and understanding that this is not an opinion, this is a fact, that colonization has led us to where we are, not only culturally, politically, economically, but also environmentally, and making sure that these are things we carry as we go into these rooms. And I think I shared with Helen a recent article. He talked about how alternatives that are peddled around as by rich countries and emerging countries that are very oil reliant, as something that they can get away with the emissions, things like carbon markets, and how they are pushing marginalized peoples off their land, and they are really here to exonerate the rich, and they can continue polluting while the poor can pay the price. Or we are going to conserve. What is a just transition? What is a just conservation? And what does racism and colonization have to do with the recent moves in conservation in the name of climate action? So all those things are very, very important. And as feminists, this is a very important issue, that all the policies, we question that, we use all the available knowledge that we have been able to get from our ancestors and our living, practitioners and academics, to really critique these frameworks and offer alternatives, and what that looks like for us based on our best known lived experiences in our countries. So I'm so sorry, earlier the chat was not open, actually. So I asked people to introduce themselves, and then I locked, the door. But we are back. It's open now. We're sorry. So feel free to exchange information, share resource that you have, any feedback. And thank you for sticking with us. We are now getting into our question and answer session for this part. And we already have a question, and I see Toni responded, but I wanted other people maybe to really benefit from this. It was an anonymous attendee who asked about do we really need African feminist foreign policy? How would this look like, considering the diversity of Africanness? Do we need to engage the global north to ensure that implementation of their FFP addresses the diverse needs of African women plus realities of diverse contexts? What kind of African women are we speaking to? It's a lot of questions. Decolonial conversation, you can see in the chat, decolonial conversations are useful. However, I think our conversations should be about the reality of this FFP to the lived experiences of African women. And what would FFP mean? Very many questions loaded. Everyone feel free to do that, but also really constantly trying to remind ourselves that no, feminism is not about women, it's about people, and how systems of marginalization place us in positions of of oppression. So women in their diversities, queer Africans, migrant Africans, our feminism is for everybody, no ifs, no buts. So I think we need to continue understanding that it's beyond just women, and we are talking. And if you're asking which women, we should be talking to people, not just women, because feminism is beyond, as a lens, as a practice, as an ideology, is not just about women. It's about also understanding all these marginalizations, and we cannot drop decolonization, because we are here because of colonization. Any conversation that does not start with acknowledgement of colonial crimes and colonial destabilization of our civilizations and placing us where we are at, I think cannot really help us move forward. I just wanted to say those things. So our panelists, what parts of the questions would you like to take a step on? Toni, you already responded. Maybe you could just respond a bit and give us a little more explanation on what you responded.
Right. Thank you. And I want to say thank you to all the folks who've been asking questions. It's been really useful, actually, to also get us thinking. And as you said, there are quite a few questions, but maybe I'll start from the one at the end, because I haven't answered that one yet. So that was from Nancy about FFP agenda as it emerges in a Global North initiative. Compromise, is it compromise from the start? The sense that it's actually poison chalice from the West and imperial feminism. It tarnishes any African feminists identified with this agenda. Is it even possible to redeem the concept from its neocolonial roots? Okay, so I think that's a really good engagement with the idea of feminist foreign policy. And I suspect that actually people will have different answers to this. So I will give mine, which perhaps accords with some of what we've stated in the statement. As you'll see in the statement, we're very clear that we talk about feminist informed policies. We see policies, or I see policies, as part of the output of society, right? Of living in society, of enacting what is best or what is bad about society. So the idea that of bringing feminism into the policy enactments of all actors, I think, is a normative good in of itself. Feminist foreign policy, as I stated in the beginning, I don't know that I would call it an agenda in the same way that we refer to WPS, for example, because it is foreign policy, and foreign policy relies on both the internal domestic identity being leveraged as something to do externally. So across all the states that do feminist foreign policy, there are differences and there are distinctions, even across policy areas within certain member states. So if you look at the feminist development policy of Germany that really engaged with civil society significantly, because I mean, and this is my critique, development is a low-hanging fruit. So it always seems as if they can write a good game there. But if you simply looked at the text, this would be the kind of thing that feminists have been calling for probably 100 years, about how a former colonial power engages with the global South, including some of its own former colonies. Now, to engage with that particular policy, to my mind, does not mean to identify with it. I mean, after all, none of us here are German. But we can use that policy to hold Germany to account of racism, its colonial past, and the impacts of its colonial present on African countries like Namibia, but not just Namibia, Cameroon. So thinking about former colonies, but also other African countries in general. So from my perspective, it is not our job to try to redeem feminist foreign policy, but rather to engage with it where it is, to critique it, because that is the job of a feminist, and to hold to account those that have certain global responsibilities. So regardless of whether I engage with Germany or not, they will have a climate action policy. And I would rather that does not negatively impact on Africans, particularly if it's being couched within the framework of feminism. So I think just to sort of both clarify, but also get us thinking about what does it actually mean to engage? Is an engagement an endorsement? But also to say that, you know, our outlook is not one that is, and we're very clear about that from the very beginning. We do not advocate for feminist foreign policy, not the least because we don't think foreign policy itself can ever really be feminist. But we think that all policies can engage with feminist concerns.
Thank you, Toni, on picking that up. And if we can back up a little more, any contributions on the first question on diversity of Africanness? Do we have an African feminist? Do we need an African feminist foreign policy? And I think Toni has talked about that this is not about an African feminist foreign policy, but how African feminisms are infused in policies and in foreign policies, not something like a one document that this is an African feminist foreign policy, because there are many feminisms. That's what it is. That's where the answer lies. So I don't know if anyone had any responses, additions to that question before we pick up another.
Yeah, if I can come in, Rosebell, I think it's also, we've also seen that as Africa, we are not one country. So countries have foreign policies for all of us. And I think it's also questioning that as well by engaging and by actually saying, you know, when you have a feminist foreign policy or a foreign policy for Africa, there are people making decisions for the continent. And I think it's also to say, even us as African feminists, we do, it's not foreign for us to be thinking, to be theorizing on the different ways of which we can engage. I think the statement of intent mentions Maputo Protocol, the African Feminist Charter of Principles, among other discourses. But I think what's important is we cannot be silent whilst my position is, if people are talking about you, making decisions about you, it's important to be in that space and to also start challenging and putting out there that you are saying your foreign policy is about addressing equity. I think it's a German foreign policy, a feminist foreign policy, which is even using decolonial language. So you find a lot of capturing of the language. And yet when we see them negotiating on issues on climate, they're against, for example, the loss and damage fund. They've not even committed to the commitments that they had to the 100 billion or some of those major commitments. Their governments are not even committing to that. So I think it's important, maybe as African feminists, to have that space where we can start questioning, but also looking at how the African Union itself doesn't have an outward, like one foreign policy to look at the multiplicity of the different partnership and bilaterals as well. So I think it's something that can be dismissed by some as, okay, this is just the Northern agenda and initiative. But I think it's also to say, as African feminists, we can also, be upfront in terms of really questioning, because at the end of the day, those policies do affect us. And I think it's important for us to ensure that we are also challenging them as well.
Thank you, Memory. I wanted to bring you, Reem, into the conversation, because part of the questions were about what kind of African women are we speaking to? Is this a discourse? I think someone also alluded to that in terms of Is this a discourse of all African women, not just oppressed majority? I don't know about oppressed majority. We are all under oppression, so so we need to acknowledge that, like, we live in colonized states, so we are under oppression. The intensities and intersections might be different, from religion to gender to sexual orientation. So I don't know about oppressed majority, but we acknowledge that the various oppressions that different people face in our countries because of their social markers, colonial indicators that are left behind and all that. And but we get the spirit of the question in terms of like how diverse the African. Again, we are not talking about African feminist foreign policy, because it's not what we are talking about. We're talking about how we as African feminism, we can inform all these foreign policies that are claiming challenge, inform. When you use that you're acting this in the name of feminism, what are you really doing? Are you covering what the feminist principles that we acknowledge as African feminist movements? So the question is about like probably how inclusive and bringing everybody from different directions. And Reem has been at the committee representing various Sudanese women in the political and civil processes. So Reem, if you can speak to that.
Thank you, Rosebell, and thank you, Nancy, for the excellent question. I think in my presentation, I said two things connected to your question, and the first is that we need to be very careful. I mean, right now we are talking about, feminist foreign policy, and this is also a way for us to look at not only our foreign policy as African countries, but also as to look at our internal policies. Are they also feminist? So it's important to do that, and it's important to take into consideration that when we talk about feminist foreign policy, it should not be just another phase or concept that we adopt and then we drop, when there's no longer funding or when the international community is no longer focusing on it, because a lot of the things is every few years you have something that everyone is pushed to focus on, and then we move on to something else without making sure that we are building some kind of revolutionary infrastructure. That feminist foreign policy should, for example, it should feed into what we've already been saying for many years on mainstreaming, on feminist conceptualization, feminist theories, and so many of the things that we have been talking about for many years. So the feminist foreign policy framework should be something that we should always take into consideration from now on, and it should be something that we should push for, and it should become part of the work that we do. When it comes to who's really championing this, like what you called an agenda, I think it's important to look at our feminist or women's movements, because not all countries have feminist movements. But let's examine our women's movements. Who controls our women's movements? Okay, is feminist activism or activism for women's rights in our countries, is it completely controlled by NGOs? Are the spaces NGOs? Is it completely driven by donor funding? Is it completely driven by the polarization that is happening on the political front? Are the women's groups controlled by political parties, patriarchal political parties? Are the women groups controlled by, religious fundamentalist groups? So let's examine the women's movement, that we're part of in our countries, and unless we work on fixing it, and by fixing it, I mean ensuring that we develop, or we give a chance for organic feminist movements to develop. And by organic, I mean that, they should be basically, that they should not be focused on donor, funding. They should not be focused on in the capital city, that all the different women associations should pop up in different places in the country, and their voices should matter. So unless we reach to this level that we are, in a way critical of the women's movements we have in the country, then we will forever be stuck in a situation where you just have a few representing the majority and representing their voices, and not giving a chance for people to kind of, take your place, basically. And this is something that we have to think about, that, I move somewhere else, someone else comes to take my place, and I take someone else's place, and this is how the cycle should continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reem. And I wanted to add, in terms of understanding like how we arrive at this place, I think Toni has excellently put it across. The fact that we had different forum and we saw this discourse rising and a lot of investments going into what states are calling feminist foreign policies, but the policies are not really feminist. They are just picking one issue and say, oh, we want to be progressive on this, and slap the word feminist there. And a lot of us were invited in these kind of spaces to look, say, oh, Germany is having this, what do you think of that? And you get tired, you're like, no, I'm not here to talk about what your country is doing as an ad zone. I know, like, usually these things begin in the capitals in the north, and before you know it, your country has what it's called a feminist foreign policy that actually, it's implementing the policy that is anti-women, anti-poor people, that it's queer African people from existing. So we see the countries choosing whatever they want to call feminist, and that in itself, we're articulating the fact that that in itself, that process is hijacking feminism as a practice and an ideology for which marginalized people have used for generations to reclaim their rights. So that's the point from which we are coming at this, and it's very important to begin. That's why we say, okay, now let's put a collective. How do we start imagining our engagement with this area is very important, and hopefully that this knowledge, because we are all here because we are very invested in knowledge creation, generation, and knowledge sharing, and knowledge, protecting our own knowledge, right? And saying this is our knowledge, this is our lived reality, and hope that many more people, many more organizations can actually engage with what foreign feminist policies are going on about, and in a way, then establish what are those issues that you need to be interrogating when someone is inviting you, oh, we are bringing this to your country because we have a feminist foreign policy, right? And like, okay, come and sign on that. And oftentimes our organizing can look like that, right? So someone comes and before you know it, your name is on some foreign policy document that that doesn't look like anything you support apart from the small part you have contributed. So it's very important to redefine these things for ourselves and create our own centers of knowledge where we can say, this is what we believe in, right? Like, you're not a feminist, and you're not leading feminist foreign policy in Europe while you support the war in Gaza and genocide of Palestine, and we are together here. We are not going to be together because we are colonized people and we understand what occupation looks like. So we are not going to be with you. So it's very, very important to have our own centers of power, and knowledge is power. And that's why we have put this collective here, so that we are able to we are not just an ad zone to what the West is doing or what countries in the West are doing, but we also know that our governments can chase also money and can easily say, this is our foreign feminist policy, while your country is in Congo invading communities and making instability, in the case of my country, on behalf of the empires that are seeking the conflict minerals in Congo. So it's very, very important for us to ground ourselves and to explain these realities and these frameworks, infuse them with our own experiences. Do we have any other question? Yes. Okay. I think there is a question by Adan. The recent COP28 draft agreement, which calls for consideration of conflict and climate as converging forces. What does feminist decolonial effort to address the intersection of conflict and climate look like? Do we have, yes, I see Toni partly responded. Do we have any responses on conflict and climate and what the decolonial approaches can look like?
I can come in and attempt to answer. So I think some decolonial practices can really look at maybe if we look at how most of the transition minerals, like when you talk of the just transition, we're looking at minerals that are going to I mean, the way when we look at issues around renewable energy, for example, most of the conversations, like I mentioned earlier, are really about a technological move where we're looking at having, solar technology, batteries, and what have you. And those minerals are actually within the countries where we find most conflict. And we also see even some of the countries are even, still going on for fossil fuels. And so I think, and in those countries where you find those resources, that's where you get most of the conflict. So there's always that connection where we know that we do have some countries which will support conflict disturbances in order to have access to extract those minerals. So I think the decolonial conversation should really be about how do we start making sure when we talk of just transition, and for those minerals that are going to be extracted, how do we make sure that the discussions are for developing also those countries? So you find in countries where there's a lot of extraction, there's a lot of displacement, there's a lot of migration, a lot of abuse, oppression going on in those countries. Those countries are left with absolutely nothing. None of that is even going to develop. Everything is still the same colonial agenda of making sure the transition is going to happen more in the global north, being supported by the global south and by the global south minerals. So it means that the whole colonial agenda has actually not even ended. So I think it's important to now just start bringing that awareness and questioning around what we need to do as alternatives. How do we come together within the global south, have the coalitions in terms of coming together and saying, when we talk of a just transition, what does it really mean for us? The energy, the gap, how do you make sure we are addressing the gaps which will make us, we are not going to have that industrial development like we know, I mean, in the way which was, oh, sorry, there's a monkey in my house, which was like, which happened when there was colonial, sorry, Rosebell.
It's all right. It's all right. We'll come back to you, memory. Yeah, don't worry about that. Good luck with it. There's somebody, Wanja Maina, in the chat. You say you're from the Hummingbird Grassroots Center for a Feminist Organization that works for and with women with disabilities in Kenya. And for a long time, feminist spaces have excluded women with disabilities who deal with multiple inequalities on day-to-day. That is on point, and we need to do better. We need to do more solidarities, because there is and work together and inclusion, because we tend to see movements, disability movements are powerful and they've been able to gain a lot, to advocate, but still we tend to see them as parallel, not inclusive in the feminist and women's spaces. So very much so. So keep in touch. We have your contact. Keep in touch with us. We'll see how would engage in the collective with your work and other collectives that work with women with disabilities. That is very, very true. Then there was someone with a hand up. How am I seeing hands? I have many boxes open. Who has their hand up?
I think it was Amandla.
Okay, please go ahead, Amandla. I'm trying to find the hand.
Thank you so much. Actually, I accidentally raised my hand. I think I was trying to do reaction. But I agree with so much that was spoken here today. It really was enlightening for me. And I hope Memory is okay with her monkey.
No.
Sorry.
Thank you, Amanda. Anyone with a question would like to? Yes, I see another hand.
Rosebell, I just wanted to comment on the last question on the environment basically, and with the COP coming up and so on. So I want to mention an example of an example from Sudan. So hold on, let me just look at the question. Yeah, sorry. So the recent COP draft agreement, which calls for consideration of climate change. So I think there's an example that always that is very interesting from Sudan. So over 15 years ago, there was the peace talks to resolve the Darfur conflict, and they were taking place in Abuja. And they were, of course, as always, I think 1% of the mediators, negotiators, and attendees at the peace talks were women. So there were very few women, of course, because, the approach when it comes to the peace talks, even by the international community, is never really to focus on feminist peace, on how to make sure that women are at the center of the process. And so the armed groups, they were arguing about this lake, okay? And then they were arguing about it for quite some time until one of the women attendees said, you don't really have to argue about it because this water source is no longer there. It had actually dried up. And this really shows that, when women come to, to conflict resolution initiatives and peace talks, they're coming with their lived experiences and they're coming with their realities, because it's in that particular context, it is women, going to get the water. So they know, what dried up, what doesn't work anymore, where is the water, where to get water from. So when they're not part of the process, imagine, we would have had the men arguing about this lake until today, basically. So this is why it's very important to make sure that women are at the center of, the different talks when it comes to, peace talks, because of course, especially when we're talking about climate change, they are really bearing the brunt of it, and they understand, how they are affected by climate change, because they are the ones that see the water scarcity. They are the ones that see deforestation and how it affects their ability to farm and so on. So I just wanted to give this example to just show that there's so many real examples that we can suggest and talk about.
Okay, I will quickly allow Susan to ask the question or contribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And it's very insightful, the presentations that we are having. It's one of those things that usually happens within Africa, is that many of our governments are very good in accepting the foreign policy, but the implementation is a challenge. How do we address the challenge of implementation, especially of foreign policies, and more so the ones that are inclined to issues of women, because they are usually relegated to the very last thing that they can be able to do. I don't know, but it's a challenge. And I'm in the area of women, peace and security. And you know how many of our countries will quickly develop the national action plan, and then are not able to budget or put finances for implementation of the processes. How do we go about it? Thank you. And over to you.
Reem, do you want to respond to that one?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think here, this means that we really have to be like at the center of this process, because right now, in some contexts, and of course, I'm just speaking in our context, for example, before we talk about, feminist foreign policy in our context, we have to talk about the internal policies, and are they feminist or not? And are we part of the policy-making process or not? So I feel that there's a lot of work in my particular context, of course, because I don't want to speak about other countries. I feel that we have to do a lot of legwork and we have to do a lot of homework before we're able to articulate a good feminist foreign policy, because we can't do that unless we have policies that are truly feminist, and unless we go over our legislations, because we have so many discriminatory laws and legislations that continue to, criminalize women and ensure that they're not part of the public spaces. So to be able to really, practice what we preach, we do the legwork internally, and then after that, we can develop a policy that is in line with our different, laws and legislation. So we still have a long way to go, but I guess we have to start somewhere. And for now, I feel that it's also very important to use the different opportunities to talk about feminist foreign policy at the international arena to kind of pressure our governments as well, and to use the different policy makers who have adopted the FFP as an approach to change the way things are done internationally. And here I'm specifically talking about peace talks, because I'm really interested in how peace talks are really not working. They're empowering, men with guns and so on. So yeah, so we just have to use the framework that is in front of us right now to make sure that we are influencing the national policies.
Thank you so much, Reem. I'll pick a comment. We'll have a few minutes to go. I'll pick a comment from France, who talked about there are very few opportunities for transnational feminists to build analysis and solidarity. Other than that, I don't think we expect a lot from FP, from Global North. Love that statement. Right on. Thank you, Franz. And Nancy said, thank you, talked about the need for cross-sectorial conversation on Africa's engagement with the rest of the world and engagements with each other. Definitely, this is very important, because oftentimes we see, whether we think that the responses are fragmented, oftentimes like you have one African country at the UN Security Council, and there's a very important issue, and how do they vote? And, those are always very important, the representation. Climate change, you always see about one Africa position, for example. All these things, if we are not really engaging in those spaces in terms of how is Africa engaging with each other, determines how Africa is going to engage as a bloc at the rest of the world, right? If we are not yet talking to each other, and if the talking is between only male technocrats and politicians at that level, so we need to continue. And I know we are already doing it, but we need to take this space of foreign policy as a very important space, not just as we engage with the world, but actually how African countries engage with each other on key issues: peace and security, migration, climate change, trade, health security, as we have come, or we are coming out of the pandemic. We've seen all these realities, how it's important for African countries to be with engagement with each other, and how as feminists we can engage in this with the frameworks, like what is a foreign policy looking like when it comes to feminism. So I think we've come to the end of our engagement. I see a lot of people giving feedback. Thank you so much. We'll send all the resources that we have talked about, and if you need contacts, you have the collective will be in touch with you. You can ask us the contacts. We'll share with you in a follow-up. And Nancy had asked, how do we join the collective? I hope that Toni can answer that. But let's close. In closing, Memory, have you survived the monkey?
Well, I hear monkeys are not afraid of the female gender. So yeah. So I think in closing, I just wanted to mention something that I think is important to say. Within countries where there are feminist foreign policies, there are individual feminists who are also concerned with their own country's development of those feminist foreign policies. So I think, and I'm just saying this to say, I think not that is to redeem or to justify, but I think it opens a way for us to have avenues to tell them what their governments should be doing and to also hold them to account. So I think sometimes it's also important to also have allies within those governments who we can also reach out to and also tell them exactly what we want. And I think when we talk about an alternative, it's really looking at a decolonial and also challenging the growth model and moving more to a growth and care system which is democratic and which also allows us to live to honor indigenous knowledge and to preserve our reserves as Africans, defining for ourselves and using what we have over the years as feminists have been postulating to the world. So I think for me, that'll be it.
Thank you so much, Memory. Let's get back to you, Reem, and then Toni will close because there's a question around how do we join the collective. Thank you. Go ahead, Reem.
Thank you so much. And this is my first time being part of an event held by the collective. So it's definitely inspiring to hear voices of African feminists. And I'm happy to be here. And I hope I managed to contribute and share some thoughts and experiences from Sudan. And I hope to continue just talking to other African feminists. Thank you.
Thank you, Reem. And finally, Toni.
Right. I think just to echo Reem's point that as always, it's always fantastic to be in a space like this that is very much dominated by a variety of ideas from African feminists, because it does force us to think and to sort of sit with our thinking as well. But not only that in the questions that were asked, that there's been a lot of learning, I think, for all of us here. And I want to say, Nancy asked the question about how to join the collective. In a way, all the folks here are part of the collective. We've just been sort of doing the labor in a sort of DIY. There's no budget, nothing, just the Researchers Without Borders that is led by Helen, has a Zoom account, thankfully, and an Instagram page. So I would say for the interim that folks follow our account on Twitter, or X, formerly Twitter, that there's a page on Instagram, which is where we would tend to post the videos, and that over the next few months, we will try to think about how we can facilitate a sort of platform so that we can engage more with each other beyond just these conversations. Other than that, I think we've all included our emails, and I think all of us are also on X, formerly Twitter. So I hope people just reach out to engage bilaterally, collectively, however. But just to say, I think there was another question about the video. It will be on the Twitter account of Researchers Without Borders, and the at REWIB_Africa. And also, I think usually my link to a YouTube or something, I'm not sure, but it would definitely be on the account as with the previous one. I hope that we do continue this conversation online for now, and hopefully as we think about this in the next months, we will think about how to facilitate greater engagements. Thank you so much for all the questions and for being here. It's always scary when you put these things out, because you don't know whether people will show up. And actually, we just want to be able to have conversations and tell you where we're coming from, and to hear what your perspective is on a lot of these issues. And it is really heartening to know that there are people out there who are as concerned as we are about the state of our world as it is, and that, the idea of solidarity in feminist praxis and political thinking is still alive, and I hope that continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toni, for the great closing remarks and giving us direction on where people can find us online. And being here, it's been a great pleasure seeing everybody engaging in the chat, even when it was delayed. But also, it's a very important time in the world where we see a lot of fragmentation. We are tired. We are tired, but the struggle is not tired. So it's very, very important to find these kind of spaces to be able to get some kind of hope that we can still work together and put a dent in the oppression that does not end, does not stop, and does not waver. So our hopes and our efforts must also continue. So thank you for showing up. thank you for continuing to support in any way the work you're doing, and let us know if you have any way further engagement, whether you want to know more what particular issue would be able to connect you with people who are doing this, but to understand more how you can really leverage the framework in the work you're doing. Thank you, and take care. I hope to catch most of you somewhere online, and have a lovely day, evening, or morning. See you soon.